Global communication systems, undersea cables, satellite networks, and internet infrastructure are no longer just technical tools. They've become high-stakes assets in a global power struggle. Governments and corporations are racing to control who connects, how, and under what terms.
Over 99% of all transoceanic internet traffic goes through subsea cables.
Private companies like Elon Musk's Starlink are reshaping access to the internet, but they're also raising new concerns about ownership, security, and influence. As the digital world becomes more intertwined with geopolitics, communication infrastructure is transforming from neutral ground into a contested space.
Private telecommunication giants that are big tech companies, which are, large enough to set their own priorities and develop communication networks in their favor. So Starlink is the obvious example.
Who controls the flow of global information in a privatized, interconnected world? What happens when communication infrastructure becomes a weapon of influence?
Our activities in space date back decades, but so do our treaties, and so do our policies. And so we're really in an interesting place in terms of the governance of the space economy, because it's grown beyond what was envisioned in the original treaty documents and things like that were produced in the 1960s, 1970s.
And can international governments keep up with the pace of technological power shifts?
I think there's a sort of broad lack of understanding of the realities of the subsea cable network. And this lack of understanding can be from customers, it can be from users, it can be from governments and policymakers.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, we look at how this shift is unfolding, what it means for global stability, and the future of who really owns the internet.
But it all comes back to that communication infrastructure is what's kind of gone first. And that's something that we've learned some lessons about on Earth, and we have the opportunity to do better in space.
Joining us today is Dr. Joscha Abels, Professor Nicole Starosielski, and Nick Rees. Dr. Abels is a political scientist at the University of Tübingen, specializing in the geostrategic and economic dimensions of communication infrastructure and EU policy. Professor Starosielski is a leading scholar of media infrastructure at NYU with a focus on undersea cables, environmental impacts, and digital sustainability. Nick Rees is the co-founder of Frontier Foundry and former director of emerging technology policy at DHS, with deep expertise in cyber operations, quantum tech, and national security. Moderating the conversation is Courtney Doggart, president of Network 2020.
Okay, so to start us off, Nicole, turning to you. In our increasingly interconnected world, we often think of connectivity as being wireless, but behind the scenes, there is a lot of physical infrastructure, I think, including behind your background. And this physical infrastructure plays such a critical role. Could you start us? We're going to start off with the undersea portion. And could you just outline some of the subsea infrastructure that keeps us connected today? What's the scope? Who owns it? What's currently planned? And how does it differ from what we might see in space?
So thank you, Courtney. So first of all, subsea cables are essential to global communications today. Over 99% of all transoceanic internet traffic goes through subsea cables. Even with the rise of Starlink and more LEO satellite constellations, we see the vast majority, almost all subsea traffic being routed through subsea cables. So these systems are still essential to the global internet. And the reason for this is multiple. First of all, it is the cheapest and lowest latency, i.e. the fastest way to communicate. When you're thinking about the scale of the internet, the need for quick and high capacity transmission, subsea cable is still the way to go. And it looks like that for the near future. Satellites still play an important role, which I think I'm going to allow Nick, who has the expertise in this area, to speak more about. And I'll also say that these systems are almost entirely privately owned. So the subsea cable network, the global subsea cable network, is not a government-owned infrastructure. It is largely owned by individual companies who come together, sometimes in a consortium where they build together, and sometimes individual companies will finance and build their own infrastructure. But this is not usually owned or regulated by an international governmental organization.
And just to follow up on that, what role do governments play? Where does the private and the public intersect? Is that, where the cables come out of the ocean onto the ground, or how does that work?
Yeah, so governments do still play a really important role. Largely, they regulate the landings. So they'll regulate cable landings. Usually, cables have to secure a cable landing license. Governments also have control over their territorial waters and some rights to their exclusive economic zone. In the high seas, cables are governed under UNCLOS, which is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And that is also enforced by not all governments, but aligned with government practice generally aligns with UNCLOS specifications and regulations. So I think I would just say governments still play a really important role in the protection of subsea cables and determining which subsea cables, how easy it is for subsea cables to land on their shores.
Thank you. And then turning to above Earth, Nick, could you kind of give us a primer on what we're seeing about in the skies?
Yes, absolutely. So thanks, Courtney, and my thanks to Network 2020 for the opportunity to speak to all of you. So when we think about space, we've been doing activities in space for a long time. And launching satellites or launching humans into space is not new to us, but there is kind of a critical difference now. So whereas before the space domain was kind of the exclusive area for a handful of governments and a few contractors that worked with them, but we had a really big transition, and that transition was into the commercial space economy. And so now what we have is what was once a very kind of limited space for players is now a very expansive space for players. And there's a really important line that I think is important that we need to draw. And so that line is what happened when the launch cost per kilogram went down. And what I'm referring to is how much money does it cost to launch a kilogram of material from the Earth into low Earth orbit or even beyond. And that's a really, really important number. And so if you look back kind of at the height of the shuttle program, we had launch cost per kilogram that was over $50,000 per kilogram. And that is prohibitively expensive for anyone but governments, really. But when we saw SpaceX come along with its reusable rockets and things like that, they brought that launch cost per kilogram down so far that you could manage, commercial companies, universities, things like this could manage to launch their own satellites. And then you had things like cube satellites, which are very, very small and meant to be only last kind of a small amount of time, but they're light and they're easy to get into orbit. And so once we crossed over into that threshold, we no longer had kind of this world where just limited players and limited number of satellites. We actually saw a real kind of power law raise in the number of satellites in orbit. Because what we found is that there's a demand for services from space to us Earthlings here on the ground. And people are willing to pay for that. And so, of course, as commercial opportunities arise, you have people that come in to fill that gap. And so specific to kind of communications and things like that, the obvious one is Starlink. So we have thousands of satellites that are on orbit now that are providing internet to areas that might have been, deficient or might not have had kind of the type of connectivity that, major cities or places like that might have. But there's also some geopolitical aspects to this too. And we saw that during the early days of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so, what Nicole was talking about like the cooperation, the private, being owned privately versus, government ownership, that's very much at play now. in space. But one of the things that's really important to think about is how critical that communications kind of infrastructure is to Earth. And then think about how critical that communication infrastructure is as we move beyond low Earth orbit. And that's something we can touch on later. But the point I want to make is we're creating a system where we have a lot of commercial opportunity in space. Companies are launching into space. Our activities in space date back decades, but so do our treaties, and so do our policies. And so we're really in an interesting place in terms of the governance of the space economy, because it's grown beyond what was envisioned in the original treaty documents and things like that were produced in the 1960s, 1970s. So there's a lot more to dive into there, but that's kind of an overview of what we're looking at in low Earth orbit, especially.
Right. And I hope we can get to that, because I feel like the geopolitical dimensions of how we're coming up with treaties is also an interesting point in time. So just to clarify, previously we had satellites that were up much higher, and now we have Starlink because of the lowered costs that are now in lower Earth orbit, right? Is that a solid understanding?
Well,
and can you give us a sense of the scope of differentiation there?
Sure. So there have been satellites in low Earth orbit since Sputnik. And so low Earth orbit is somewhere in the 500 to 1,200 kilometer range in altitude. And the big difference there is that in low Earth orbit, satellites actually still deal with atmospheric drag. And so they're at a low enough kind of altitude that they're still, feeling the effects of our atmosphere. So that range, that orbital space, has been used for a very long time. So there's low Earth orbit, there's medium Earth orbit, which has less atmospheric drag issues, and then there's geosynchronous orbit. So geosynchronous orbit, to give you an idea of scale, at 500 kilometers in altitude, where low Earth orbit is, geosynchronous orbit is out to like 32 to 35,000 kilometers. And the difference there is that when the satellite rotates around the Earth, it rotates at the same rate. So the satellite always stays above the same area of Earth. And for example, GPS, or other position, navigation, and timing, or PNT services, that's where those satellites are. And there's some advantages to having that in that area. Obviously, one being geosynchronous, the other being that you're not in range of surface-launched weapons. And so that's another aspect of low Earth orbit that we now have to consider from the geopolitical standpoint that we did not have to consider before.
Great. And that is actually a nice segue into your experience at the Department of Homeland Security. So how does the U.S. government define and safeguard critical communication infrastructure? And what are some of these key risks that I think you just outlined? And are there other emerging threats that we should be watching?
Yes. So going into the critical infrastructure part for a second, the U.S. has 16 critical infrastructure sectors. And basically, those infrastructure sectors are the things that we say that our society has to have, or else there will be a major impact to our national security, our economic security, our homeland security. And so you can think there's 16 of them. CISA.gov actually has them if you want to read more about them. But there are things like transportation, healthcare, emergency services, obviously communications, even like water, wastewater, dams is another one. And all of those pieces of critical infrastructure are things that we say are so important that we can't afford to let them fail. And if they fail, we have to have such resilience that the downtime is reduced. So when we think about critical infrastructure, why did we say that? Why do we build that model? Well, we built the model because it defines how we respond to something. So if emergency services is down in a particular area, we view that as critical. And we're going to marshal our resources. We're going to move people and resources to move and create a resilience to that problem. So recover quickly and build resilience against the next problem. And so this process is owned by the Department of Homeland Security through the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, which is a part of DHS, owns this. And there's a national resilience strategy that was published in January. But as of just last week, there was a new executive order that came out from President Trump called Achieving Efficiency Through State and Local Government Preparedness, something like that. And that executive order, among other things, actually says that they're going to redo the national resilience strategy. So there's more to come there. Imagine, we'll see a draft of that in the next, say 90 to 120 days.
Great, thank you. Yosha, turning to you. The role of private infrastructure in geopolitical conflicts, it seems to be getting more pronounced, but it could just be our vantage point. Things like Starlink's involvement in Ukraine, I think, is one that a lot of people have questions about, or the severing of undersea cables. Is there a rise in the intersection of private infrastructure and geopolitics, and what implications do cases like these have for global security and governance?
Yeah, thank you, Courtney. Also, again, thank you for Network 2020 for putting together this panel. So I'm going to build a lot on what Nicole has said and Nick has said as regards the basic characteristics of those two communication networks. So I think generally what we have to understand, Nicole already pointed towards that, is that the core of the communication infrastructure, be it satellites or cables under the sea, is increasingly owned by private companies. And when we think about that, I think sometimes we have this picture in mind of this kind of 1970s telecommunication companies that were state-owned back then. But I mean more of this kind of corporation that are private telecommunication giants, that are big tech companies, which are, large enough to set their own priorities and develop communication networks in their favor. So Starlink is the obvious example. I mean, it's a privately owned company. It's controlled by Elon Musk. I think he owns 42% of shares. So in any case, Starlink is kind of the pioneering firm in satellite communication, in that it was able to scale this up, this idea of having these low Earth orbit communication satellites, of which you need a lot. I mean, this is kind of one of the implications of what Nick said. If you have a satellite in geostationary orbit, of course, it can cover more parts of the Earth than if you have one closer to the Earth in lower altitude. You need more of them, which is why the constellation is so expansive. And there are other competitors like Amazon, which has a project Kuiper's currently, which will be trying to catch up to Starlink. But as Nicole said, while Starlink receives a lot of attention, and rightfully so, we have to be aware that most of our communication actually run through the undersea network, which is fiber optic cables. And when you look at ownership structures there, you have also very recently kind of a shift, which is towards, I would say, smaller consortia of less companies together building these major trans-regional cables, and at times then being even owned by single owners, which are often, again, US tech firms. So Google and Meta are very big in this regard, are currently expanding their own networks. There are, of course, some counteracting tendencies. There are state-owned companies from China intervening in the markets. There are telecommunication companies from the Middle East that are getting more influential. But I would say a key insight is that most of the infrastructure in our everyday communication and economic transactions are owned by some very influential corporations.
Great. Thank you for that. And just for those who are listening, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them in a little bit. Nicole, just looking at the sustainability of this digital infrastructure, what are some of the challenges that you see that are facing the subsea cable industry? How sustainable is this current model, especially with some of the shifts that Yosha just mentioned? And what steps would you like to see being taken to ensure long-term resilience and sustainability?
Great. Thank you again for the question. I want to talk a little bit about the sustainability of the current model, not simply in terms of environmental sustainability, which is one of the things that I've been working on, but instead about the sustainability of the industry as it is. So one of the problems with the industry right now, one of the challenges that they face, is that you see on one hand a lot of veterans in the industry looking towards retirement. And these people have really done an excellent job in maintaining, operating the subsea network, for the past few decades. After the dot-com bust and the sort of telecom bust in the early 2000s, there weren't a lot of new people hired into this industry. So we don't see a next generation stepping in to sort of take the lead and to develop and build these networks at the very moment that demand is skyrocketing. So that's one of the things that I've been really concerned with at the University of California, Berkeley, and we're launching a new certificate in global digital infrastructure for just this purpose. But I think there was another motivator for launching this certificate program, and another problem that I see the industry facing, which is the problem of awareness. For a long time, people have not known about subsea cables. I wrote the Undersea Network in 2015. And even, in 2023, I would give talks and people would say, but wait, the internet is carried by subsea cables. So, not that there had been many moments in which there had been articles and books written about subsea cables, but they don't seem to stick. People can't really keep them in mind because they run so counter to our imagination of what communication should be, which is wireless, transcending space and time. And so as a result, I think there's a sort of broad lack of understanding of the realities of the subsea cable network. And this lack of understanding can be from customers, it can be from users, it can be from governments and policymakers. And so there really needs to be, in my mind, a kind of broader connection, whether you think about that as outreach or education, or simply enhancing the communication itself between the industry and all of the governments out there that are interested in securing their subsea networks. There's a new ITU initiative on subsea cable resilience that is seeking to do this work. The International Cable Protection Committee has been seeking to do this work. But I think that there's a need for a much broader interface between all of this digital infrastructure that our lives depend on now and, the people who are dependent on them.
And just to follow up with that, what are the consequences, but both in terms of the pipeline of talent that you described, and if these larger conversations aren't happening, what could be a worst case scenario?
I mean, I think the worst case scenario is, first of all, you have a lot of expertise out there, and there's not a textbook in how things are done. And if you lose that expertise and you lose that history and that knowledge about how things are laid, how, what kinds of practices have been, what kinds of best practices are out there, a lot of that knowledge is stored in people. And so when you lose that, I think as a whole, that makes any system more vulnerable. If you don't have the appropriate understanding of both the technical, the environmental, the social, the policy, the regulatory dimensions of a system, then you can't maintain and operate it, and you especially cannot make it resilient to unexpected disruptions or consequences. Everything is fine. If everything is running smoothly and there are no disruptions and the world just proceeds as we imagine it today, then maybe we can do without expertise. I'm not sure that's even true as I say it right now, but I think that expertise is absolutely crucial to being able to work in a dynamic world where climate is changing, where politics are changing, where everything is changing. Who is going to adapt? I think that's the real question.
Great, thank you. Yosha, just turning back to you, you spoke about some of the trends that you see in ownership of say these undersea cables. With that in mind, how do you see the relationship between these companies and states evolving in the governance of communication infrastructure, and how might this shape national and regional policy, particularly in your neck of the woods in Europe?
I think that's an important question, because I think for a long time, the idea of scientists and of think tanks was that kind of the state is powerful enough to bring in line corporate interests and they discussed it under the label of statecraft. So to bring this in line with strategic interests of the state. And I would say that this is not fully the case anymore. You could clearly see that, at least in the US, you had state agencies being in conflict with tech firms over regulations, over their cooperation with law enforcement. You could see that what happened with Starlink in Ukraine, basically SpaceX deploying Starlink for the Ukraine military directly after the invasion, then having several, I would say, strategic shifts where they disabled or made it harder for the Ukrainian military to use Starlink for counter-offensive purposes, for recapturing Russian-occupied territory, for drone strikes, was not fully in line with the strategic interests of the US, but it happened anyway. So I would say that US tech firms, but I mean, those firms in general have become so big that this created dependencies. And I think currently the US strategy, but I'm only saying this as an outsider to these processes, is to lean into these dependencies, to reframe them as state power kind of, and deepen and build ever closer ties between the state and the tech companies. At least this is my impression. In Europe, the reality is a bit different, and it's simply because we lack a comparable tech sector. It's simple as that. This changes the dynamic. You see that here, the shift here is more towards more state-led investments in strategic sectors, but with strong involvements of the private sector. So, to give you a specific example, the EU is currently building its own low Earth orbit satellite constellation, which is called IRIS², which is meant to make Europe independent from Starlink and to push the EU space-related industries. It has a volume of over 10 billion euros, which is not a lot in US money, but it's a lot in basically volume for an EU initiative, which has a history of being being reluctant, of spending big. So for this, the EU has set up a public-private partnership that is meant to develop this system within the next 5 years. So the EU tries to respond to these security concerns and to basically get its tech sector back on track. And then at the same time, we had these warnings basically about another facet of these security concerns. I think you already mentioned that several subsea cables have been cut in the Baltic Sea. There was a series of these incidents. We had similar incidents off the coast of Taiwan, where Chinese civilian vessels dragged their anchor and cut undersea cables. We had Russia disabling satellite communications in Ukraine before its invasion. So basically all of those more or less deliberate and unintentional incidents that outline that there needs to be kind of this push towards more reliable communication. Just to say the last sentence on this, I would say that the governments are basically doing two things with regard to it. First of all, they're trying to diversify the sources. So this is why Starlink is so important currently, because it's basically, it cannot replace the subsea cables kind of the scope, but it can replace it as, when it comes to reliable communication of the military and of state agencies, etc. And the other thing that the companies are doing, that countries are doing, is they intervene into this shaping of the global network. So the US, for example, set up this Team Telecom, which is, I think, led by the National Security Division of the DOJ. And they are basically advising the government about cable projects and where to land these cables and where not to land these cables. And under their guise, the government has actually convinced US tech firms not to land their cables in Hong Kong for obvious geopolitical reasons. But this is kind of the other thing, this regulatory governance aspect through which states try to reshape a network that is privately grown.
Great, thank you, and I hope we can get more into the regulatory aspect too as well in the Q&A. Just turning to space one more time before I get to the Q&A, and again, if you're listening and have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box. Nick, just looking at the U.S. government approach to space critical infrastructure, what policy developments would you like to see in the future?
So when it comes to the critical infrastructure debate in the US, it's been ongoing for a while, and there's some people that feel very strongly on each side. So there's been kind of one side that said we should make space, kind of broadly speaking, a critical infrastructure sector within the existing terrestrial-based critical infrastructure model. So what that would mean is space would be number 17, as we talked about those 16 before. The other side says, no, we should not do that. And the argument for the no side is a lot of what's in space already would be covered under the existing 16. So if you have a communication satellite in space, it's already covered under communications anyway. The yes side would say, yeah, but it's so important to our function that we need it to be critical infrastructure. And my view is that I actually come down in a third category. I don't like to be limited to two. So my view is that instead of talking about space as critical infrastructure, we should talk about space critical infrastructure. And there's a really important distinction there. Space critical infrastructure means infrastructure in space that is critical to operations in space. And so what we're doing with kind of we'll call it the number 17 approach is we're saying we're going to take space and we're going to kind of push it into a model that was built for Earth. But there's some fundamental flaws with that. So one flaw being there are things that are critical in space that we don't view as critical on Earth. So for example, in space, your habitation, if we have a habitation on the moon or something like that, that is a critical piece of infrastructure. I'm currently in a habitation, and if I go and open the window, I'm going to get a pleasant breeze, but everything is fine. If I open a window on the moon, things are going to get bad. And so there's a lot of similar things with like propulsion, right? There's things with guidance, mining, which are all things that you have to do to have some kind of permanent or semi-permanent habitation on a celestial body, which is kind of the direction we're going. So I've argued for we should be thinking about space critical infrastructure because we need to do a couple of things. One is we need to define exactly what it is about space that is so critical for us to continue to push into beyond low Earth orbit, into cislunar space, and then even into interplanetary space. Cislunar space means that we are now far enough away from Earth that we're under the gravitational influence of the moon. So that's what cislunar space means. And so in order to do that, we need infrastructure. And if you look at what's being built already, NASA is working on a LunaNet project, which is internet and timing for the moon. And this is really interesting to look up because they're actually talking about how you would define moon time. And it's a fascinating thing to look at. And I'm just curious whether there's going to be a moonlight savings time. And so there's also Mars Link, which has been proposed by Starlink as a Mars version of Starlink. And the idea is the same, to provide communications, position navigation and timing, and communications relay for these coming missions. And so really the conversation here isn't as abstract as we think it is. We are planning to go back to the moon with humans. We are planning to build infrastructure around those trips. So we need to decide how we govern that. And currently, a lot of space thinking kind of revolves, especially in the policy world, revolves around low Earth orbit. We need to expand that into cislunar at the minimum. And so in terms of policy actions that I'd like to see, I think it's two things. One is we need to give serious conversation and serious thought to critical infrastructures for space, which I'll admit is not something that we've thought about before, but there's an excellent case to be made on why we should. The second is we need to think about areas in space that are strategically important. And this sounds kind of weird, but follow me on this. There are certain orbital spaces or certain areas in orbit that we might want to use that are more strategic than another. So for example, if I'm worried about somebody shooting down my satellite, what if I place that satellite right next to a critical satellite of another country? If you shot at it, and it's not fair to say shot down because it doesn't fall. The debris just continues around the Earth forever. But if you shot it, you would also destroy the satellite next to it. So there is a such thing as kind of like a high ground in space. So we need to kind of define those and define space lines of communication, just like we have sea lines of communication. We need to define those, because without that, we have a hard time coming up with how we respond to incidents, how we build infrastructure, how we send humans to these different places, and how we continue to explore. But it all comes back to that communication infrastructure is what's kind of gone first. And that's something that we've learned some lessons about on Earth, and we have the opportunity to do better in space.
Great, thank you. You were talking about policy from the U.S. standpoint, and of course, as we were talking about before this discussion actually started, it's almost like the Wild West in low Earth orbit. What exists at the moment in terms of attempts to govern this space internationally?
Yeah. So a lot of the existing treaties date back to the 1960s, 1970s. So the big one, obviously, is the 67 Outer Space Treaty. And this treaty defines a lot of things that today are a little bit, we're not so sure about. So, for example, one thing the treaty says is that an object in space is the responsibility of the country from which it was launched. But today that doesn't make as much sense, because you might have a commercial space company that might launch payloads from 4 different countries, potentially. So because it left from Cape Canaveral, does the US own all of those? Well, technically, yes. And so there's some things about the current kind of space treaty or policy world that is a little bit outdated compared to where the technology and the economy is. So another example is the 2020 National Space Policy for the US, which my team was a part of writing. One of the things in there that it says is that the US views an attack on its space assets or those of its allies as an attack on its national security, and will respond at a time, place, and domain, this is really important, of its choosing. Now, the 67 Outer Space Treaty says that space is for peaceful use only, but now we're saying, there's the potential to respond militarily. But we're even saying, if you attack a space asset, we might attack you a different way, right? So we're saying time, place, domain of our choosing, really important. So there's a couple of things out there, and we also have, in the US, we have the FAA. They regulate launches and reentries. So there's a set of regulations around those. But there are some gaps. So there are some gaps around commercial space launch, physical, like space launch facilities, and who owns that security. There's gaps around kind of like not what you can launch, but Starlink was allowed to launch thousands of satellites, and we didn't really think a lot about that, right? We just kind of did it. And so there's some of that more nuanced, orbital debris, orbital space traffic management is still coming online. And in the US, the Department of Commerce owns that, and they are working toward some things to improve that. So there's definitely a lot of places to go, but the important thing here is we do have things on the shelf, some of which are outdated, and it's going to be hard for us to update them.
Great.
And just to add to that, sorry.
Yes.
So you can see that kind of the response of this updating is a fragmented process, right? It's not a holistic process where you would have an international agency developing, or I don't know, a multilateral platform developing an alternative, but you have a US response, and the European Union has forever been working on what they call the EU space law, which is basically their own regulation and set of rules about how to guarantee the resilience and the safety of space assets, and also about the sustainability of space assets, which is clearly, pushed back against US tech firms' usage of low Earth orbit and the threat of debris and the threat to the ozone layer by burning those satellites, etc. So it's a very fragmented space, unfortunately.
Right, which seems to be reflective of also the current geopolitical environment too. So in the final 2 minutes, I think what I'd like to just do is just go around really quickly. You all have such varying and great expertise. What is the one thing, and I'll start with you, Yosha, what is the one thing that you would most want to see in order to guarantee, let's say, the access and security to communication infrastructure at the moment?
I mean, this would, of course, depend on what perspective you're talking about, but as a perspective of European, I mean, I'm not, I think that the idea that the EU has kind of generally with regard to Iris Square, which I spelled out, to build networks that are owned, state-owned to some degree. So in principle, they can be democratically controlled, at least to some degree. It's not a bad idea to diversify and to still, rely on private actors, of course, but have this as a fallback option or kind of diversifying operators of our communication networks. That would be, I think, one of the steps that would be very fruitful.
What about you, Nick?
From the space perspective, widening the lens from a tight focus on low Earth orbit out into cislunar and interplanetary space, and an acknowledgement of what we need to be successful in all of those domains in space.
All right. And Nicole, under the sea.
I mean, I would say that what we need is collaboration and coordination with experts in the field between governments and industry bodies. This is work that the International Cable Protection Committee has been advocating for. It's a global infrastructure. And so it traverses so many different environments, territories, jurisdictions. And so we need to have collaboration and coordination.
On that note, Yosha, Nicole, Nick, thank you so much. This was fascinating. Really appreciate the work you do and your time today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.